Good evening all, and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight, we venture into one of America's most haunted wilderness corridors, where 2,190 miles of isolated trail have witnessed horrors that defy explanation. The Appalachian Trail stretches from Georgia to Maine, cutting through dense forests where hikers have vanished without trace, encountered creatures that should not exist, and experienced phenomena that shatter our understanding of reality. What you are about to hear are 10 documented accounts from those who walked this path seeking adventure, but found something far more sinister waiting in the ancient mountains. These are not campfire tales passed down through generations. These are recent events investigated by authorities and verified by witnesses who can never unhike what they experienced. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let's step into the shadows of the Appalachian deep woods, where civilization ends and terror begins. About 6 months ago, at 29, I finally saved enough to take the sabbatical I had been dreaming about since college. A full-through hike of the Appalachian Trail, starting at Springer Mountain in Georgia and ending 2,190 miles later at Mount Cryptid in Maine. I worked remotely as a graphic designer for a tech startup in Seattle, spending most of my days staring at screens in a cramped apartment that never got enough natural light. After my relationship with Emma ended in February, the walls of that apartment started closing in on me in a way I could not explain. She had been the one who wanted the outdoor adventures, the weekend camping trips, the constant motion. Without her, I felt stuck in place, like I was watching my life happen to someone else. The trail seemed like the perfect way to reset everything, to figure out who I was when nobody was watching, when there were no notifications to check, or deadlines to meet, or expectations to fulfill. I spent 3 months preparing for the hike, researching gear online, and joining forums where experienced thru-hikers shared advice about everything from blister prevention to bear safety. I bought a lightweight tent from REI, a sleeping bag rated for below freezing temperatures, and a pack that the salesperson promised would distribute weight evenly across my hips and shoulders. My brother Tyler drove me to the trailhead at Amicalola Falls State Park on a humid morning in early September, the air thick with moisture and the smell of pine trees. He kept making jokes about me getting eaten by bears or losing my mind in the wilderness, but I could see the worry in his eyes when he hugged me goodbye in the parking lot. I promised to check in whenever I had cell service, to let him know I was alive and not regretting every decision that led me to this moment. The first 2 weeks on the trail felt like exactly what I needed. The physical exhaustion of hiking 15 miles a day with a 30-pound pack somehow quieted all the noise in my head that had been building for months. I met other hikers at shelters along the way, people with trail names like Barefoot and Thunder, who shared stories around campfires and offered advice about upcoming terrain. The community felt welcoming in a way I had not expected. Like everyone understood we were all out here running from something, or searching for something, or maybe both at the same time. My legs adapted to the constant climbing and descending. My shoulders stopped aching from the pack weight, and I started to believe I might actually make it all the way to Maine without turning back. Everything changed on day 17, about 3 miles past the Blood Mountain shelter in northern Georgia. The trail had been relatively crowded that morning, with at least a dozen other hikers passing me in both directions, everyone greeting each other with the standard trail courtesies and encouragement. But around 2 in the afternoon, as I rounded a bend near a rocky outcrop that overlooked a valley filled with autumn colors, I noticed something that made me stop walking entirely. A backpack was lying in the middle of the trail, just sitting there, like someone had set it down to take a break and then forgotten about it. The pack was a bright orange color, impossible to miss, and it looked expensive, the kind serious thru-hikers invested in for long-distance treks. I called out thinking maybe the owner was nearby, perhaps taking photos at the overlook or answering nature's call behind some trees. No response came back except the wind moving through the branches and the distant call of a crow somewhere in the canopy above. I approached the pack carefully, not wanting to disturb someone's property, but also concerned that something might be wrong. When I got close enough to examine it, I felt my stomach tighten with unease. The pack was fully loaded, bulging with gear, and the hip belt was unbuckled like someone had just shrugged it off their shoulders without bothering to secure anything. I touched the main compartment and felt it was still slightly warm, like body heat had been pressed against it very recently. I unzipped the top pocket slowly, telling myself I needed to find identification so I could report this to the next ranger station. Inside was a wallet containing a Maryland driver's license belonging to a woman named Sarah Chen, age 26, with an address in Baltimore. There was also a fully charged smartphone with a cracked screen protector, a water bottle that was 3/4 full, a bag of trail mix that had been opened, and a paper map marked with highlighter showing a planned route all the way to Cryptid. Everything a hiker would need was right there, and the fact that someone would abandon all of it in the middle of the trail without any sign of struggle made absolutely no sense. I pulled out my own phone and checked for service. 2 bars appeared at the top of the screen, enough to make a call. I dialed the local ranger station and explained what I had found, giving them my exact location based on the trail markers nearby. The ranger who answered, a man with a deep voice who identified himself as Ranger Morrison, told me to stay exactly where I was and not to touch anything else in the pack. He said someone would be there within 45 minutes to an hour, and his tone carried a weight that suggested this was not the first time he had received a call like this. I asked him if other hikers had reported finding abandoned gear in this section, and he was quiet for a long moment before responding that there had been some incidents in recent months that were still under investigation. I sat on a fallen log near the pack and waited, watching the shadows lengthen as the sun moved across the sky. Other hikers passed by during that hour, and I stopped each one to ask if they had seen a woman matching Sarah Chen's description from the license photo. Nobody had seen her. One older man wearing a faded blue bandana mentioned that this section of trail had a reputation for being unlucky, that people got turned around in the dense forest easier than you would think, but he said it in a way that made me believe he was leaving something unsaid. A younger couple hurried past after glancing at the abandoned pack, their eyes meeting each other with a look I recognized as fear poorly disguised as concern. Ranger Morrison arrived exactly 52 minutes later, hiking up the trail with a younger female ranger whose name tag read Chen, which I noticed immediately but did not comment on. Morrison was in his late 50s, with gray hair, buzzed military short, and the kind of weathered face that came from decades working outdoors. He examined the pack without touching it at first, walking around it in a slow circle while taking photographs with a digital camera. Then he put on latex gloves and went through the contents systematically, removing items one by one and placing them on a tarp he had spread on the ground. Sarah Chen's wallet, phone, first aid kit, freeze-dried meals for at least a week, extra batteries, headlamp, spare clothing, water filter. Everything was there. Everything except Sarah herself. Morrison asked me detailed questions about exactly when I had found the pack, whether I had seen anyone else on the trail, if I had noticed any unusual sounds or disturbances in the area. I answered as thoroughly as I could, but I could see from his expression that my information was not helping narrow down what had happened. The younger ranger, whose first name was Amanda, finally spoke up and mentioned that Sarah Chen had registered for a through-hike permit at Springer Mountain 11 days ago, right around the same time I had started my own hike. She also mentioned, and this is what made my skin prickle with cold despite the warm afternoon, that 2 other hikers had disappeared from this exact 10-mile section of trail in the past 18 months. Both cases remained unsolved. Morrison packed up Sarah's belongings carefully, treating everything like evidence in a criminal investigation rather than lost property from a confused hiker. He told me I was free to continue my hike, but asked that I report immediately to the next ranger station at Neal's Gap, about 6 miles north, to provide a formal written statement. He also gave me his direct number and told me to call if I noticed anything else unusual, if I found any other abandoned gear, or if anyone approached me asking strange questions. The way he emphasized that last part made me understand that he suspected foul play rather than simple mishap or injury. Amanda walked with me for the first mile after Morrison left, and during that walk, she told me things she probably was not supposed to share with a random hiker. She said the first disappearance happened 18 months ago. A 31-year-old man from Ohio named Marcus Webb, who was attempting his second through hike. His tent and sleeping bag were found set up at a campsite just off the trail, but Marcus was gone. No signs of struggle, no blood, no indication he had packed up to leave. His boots were still inside the tent. The second disappearance occurred 7 months after that. A 24-year-old woman from Florida named Rebecca Summers, whose pack was found leaning against a tree near a stream crossing. Everything inside was dry and organized, like she had just set it down for a moment to refill her water bottles. Search and rescue teams had combed the area for weeks after each disappearance, using dogs and helicopters and thermal imaging equipment. Nothing was ever found. No bodies, no additional evidence, no witnesses who saw anything helpful. Just vanished people and abandoned belongings in a section of trail that saw hundreds of hikers pass through every year. Amanda left me at a trail junction with a final warning to be cautious, to camp near other hikers whenever possible, and to trust my instincts if anything felt wrong. I hiked the remaining 5 miles to Neal's Gap as the sun set, arriving at the outfitter store and hostel just as they were closing for the evening. I gave my statement to the ranger stationed there, a woman who looked exhausted and kept rubbing her temples like she had a headache that would not quit. She thanked me for reporting what I found and said they were doing everything they could to locate Sarah Chen and determine what was happening in this section of trail. I asked her point blank if she thought the disappearances were connected, if there was some kind of predator, human or otherwise, targeting hikers. She could not answer that officially, she said, but then she looked me directly in the eyes and told me that if I wanted to skip ahead and avoid this entire section, nobody would judge me for prioritizing safety over completing every single mile. I spent that night in the hostel bunk room, lying awake while other hikers snored around me, unable to stop thinking about Sarah Chen's pack sitting in the middle of the trail, with her whole life still inside it. The next morning, I made a decision that felt simultaneously cowardly and sensible. I arranged for a shuttle to drive me 50 miles north, past the section where the disappearances had occurred, to a trailhead where I could rejoin the Appalachian Trail and continue my northbound hike. I told myself it was the smart choice, that there was no shame in avoiding danger, that completing the trail was not worth risking whatever had happened to Sarah and Marcus and Rebecca. But I could not shake the guilt that followed me for the next 80 miles of hiking. Every time I passed another solo hiker, especially women around Sarah's age, I wanted to warn them about Blood Mountain and the 10 miles beyond it. I started checking online forums obsessively whenever I had internet access, looking for updates about the search efforts or news that Sarah had been found safe. 3 weeks after I found her pack, a brief article appeared in a regional newspaper stating that the search for Sarah Chen had been suspended due to lack of leads, and her family was offering a reward for any information about her disappearance. The article mentioned that authorities were investigating possible connections to the previous unsolved cases in the same area. I made it to Virginia before I finally received the call from Ranger Morrison that I had been both hoping for and dreading. They had found something in a ravine about 2 miles off trail from where Sarah's pack had been discovered, a hidden depression in the landscape, invisible from the main trail, filled with personal items from multiple hikers spanning several years. Backpacks, tents, sleeping bags, clothing, identification cards, phones, even journals where people had documented their daily progress and thoughts. Everything carefully arranged and organized like someone was building a collection. The FBI was now involved, treating the entire area as a crime scene, and they wanted to interview me again about exactly what I had seen and found that afternoon. I left the trail the next day and drove back to Georgia to meet with federal agents who asked me the same questions Morrison had asked, but with an intensity that made it clear they believed someone had been systematically targeting hikers in that section for years, possibly decades. They showed me photographs of the items recovered from the ravine, and I recognized Sarah Chen's bright orange pack among dozens of others in various states of decay. The oldest items they found dated back to the 1990s, based on the style of gear and the dates on driver's licenses. 37 separate individuals could be identified from the belongings in that ravine. 37 people who had walked into the woods and never walked out. The investigation is still ongoing as of now, with search teams expanding their efforts to cover hundreds of square miles of wilderness surrounding Blood Mountain. 3 sets of remains have been recovered so far, but they have not released the identities publicly pending notification of families. No suspect has been arrested, though the FBI is working with behavioral analysts who specialize in serial predators who target transient populations. I check the news compulsively, looking for updates, hoping they find whoever is responsible, and hoping they find them before anyone else disappears into those woods. I never finished my through hike. I could not bring myself to get back on the trail after that, could not shake the image of Sarah Chen's pack sitting abandoned in the afternoon sunlight with everything she needed right there except her. I moved back to Seattle and returned to my graphic design job, back to the apartment I had been so desperate to escape. But now the walls do not feel confining anymore. Now they feel safe. Now I sleep with the doors locked and the lights on, grateful for the noise of the city, for the presence of neighbors on the other side of thin walls, for the certainty that if I scream, someone will hear me. Sometimes at 3 in the morning, I wake up thinking about the 37 sets of belongings in that ravine, wondering if Sarah Chen managed to run and hide somewhere, wondering if she is still out there in those mountains, hoping someone will find her before he does. At 26, I was 3 years into my doctorate in wildlife biology at the University of Tennessee, specializing in black bear behavior and population dynamics in the southern Appalachians. My dissertation required extensive field research, which meant spending weeks at a time hiking remote sections of the Appalachian Trail through Tennessee, setting up camera traps, collecting scat samples, and documenting bear activity patterns in areas where human interaction was minimal. I'd grown up in rural Montana, the daughter of a forest ranger and a veterinarian, so being alone in the wilderness never bothered me the way it seemed to unsettle other researchers. If anything, I preferred the company of animals to people, found their behavior more predictable and honest than the social dynamics of academic departments where egos and funding competed for dominance. In mid-October, I started a 2-week research stint focusing on the section of trail near Clingman's Dome, the highest point on the entire Appalachian Trail at 6,643 feet. The area was known for healthy black bear populations, and I wanted to document their pre-hibernation feeding behaviors as they prepared for winter. I carried a 45-pound pack loaded with research equipment, a professional-grade camera with telephoto lens, 12 trail cameras, sample collection kits, a satellite phone for emergencies, and enough freeze-dried meals to last 3 weeks if necessary. My advisor, Dr. Patricia Hendricks, had signed off on my solo research plan with the usual warnings about bear safety and weather conditions, but she trusted my experience and judgment after watching me handle fieldwork in grizzly country back in Montana. The first 4 days passed exactly as I'd hoped. I documented 3 different black bears, set up my trail cameras along game trails and near water sources, and collected fresh scat samples that would later be analyzed for diet composition and stress hormones. The weather held clear and cool, perfect hiking conditions, and the autumn colors were at their peak intensity. The mountainsides painted in reds and golds that photographers traveled thousands of miles to capture. I camped in designated backcountry sites, always hanging my food properly in bear-resistant fashion, always keeping my camp clean and my equipment organized. By day 5, I had fallen into a comfortable routine that felt more like home than my cramped apartment near campus. Everything changed on the morning of day 6, October 19th, when I was checking a game trail that ran parallel to a stream about a quarter mile from the main Appalachian Trail. The ground was soft from recent rain, perfect for capturing tracks, and I was photographing a nice set of deer prints when I noticed something else pressed into the mud near the water's edge. At first, I thought it must be a black bear print, but as I knelt down to examine it more closely, I realized the morphology was completely wrong. The track measured 18 inches long and showed 5 distinct toe impressions, but the proportions were humanoid rather than ursine. The heel was elongated, the toes spread wide, and the depth of the impression suggested something significantly heavier than a human, but walking on 2 legs rather than 4. I spent 20 minutes photographing that print from every angle, taking measurements with my field ruler, making detailed notes in my research journal. My scientific training told me to consider all rational explanations first. Perhaps it was a deformed bear print, or multiple overlapping prints that created an illusion of something else, or even a hoax left by someone with too much time and a desire to perpetuate local legends. But the stride pattern extending along the stream bank told a different story. Whatever made these tracks was bipedal, had a stride length of approximately 7 feet, and was moving with purpose rather than wandering aimlessly. I had studied animal locomotion extensively as part of my degree, had analyzed hundreds of hours of trail camera footage showing how different species moved through terrain, and nothing in my education accounted for what I was seeing in that mud. I decided to set up 2 of my trail cameras focused on this exact location, hoping to capture whatever animal was making these tracks. The cameras were motion activated with infrared night vision capability, could record video and still images, and would timestamp everything they captured. I positioned them at different angles to ensure complete coverage of the game trail, then marked the location on my GPS and continued my planned research route. That evening, back at my campsite, I found myself thinking about the Cherokee legends Dr. Hendricks had mentioned once during a lecture about indigenous perspectives on wildlife management. She had talked about stories of the Sulkaloo, the slanted-eyed giant who lived in the mountains and protected the game animals. The Cherokee who originally inhabited these mountains before their forced removal had dozens of stories about creatures that did not fit into the neat categories European settlers brought with them. The next morning, I hiked back to check the trail cameras, expecting to find footage of deer, or possibly a black bear investigating the area. What I found instead made me question whether the cameras were malfunctioning. Both units showed that motion had been detected at 3:17 in the morning, but when I reviewed the footage on the camera's preview screens, I saw only static, like someone had placed a powerful magnet near the lenses during recording. The timestamp confirmed the cameras had been recording, but the actual video was corrupted beyond recognition. I retrieved the SD cards to analyze later on my laptop back at camp, and that is when I noticed something that made my hands start shaking. Both cameras had been moved, not knocked over by an animal, but deliberately rotated on their mounting brackets so they faced away from the game trail and into the trees. The adjustment screws showed fresh scratches, like something with significant strength had forced them into new positions. I should have packed up and hiked out at that moment. Every instinct I had developed over years of fieldwork was screaming that something was wrong, that this behavior pattern did not match any known wildlife, that I was potentially in danger from an unknown variable I could not account for or plan for. But my scientific curiosity won the argument with my survival instincts. I wanted to know what had tampered with my cameras. I needed data, evidence, something concrete I could analyze and hopefully explain. So instead of leaving, I set up 4 more cameras in a wider perimeter around the original location, this time mounting them higher in trees and using security brackets that would require tools to adjust. I also set up my own camp much closer to the research area, maybe 200 yards away, so I could respond quickly if the motion alerts triggered on my satellite-connected monitoring device. That night, I lay in my tent with my bear spray and satellite phone within reach, watching the live feed from my monitoring device that showed which cameras were detecting motion. At exactly 3:33 in the morning, all 6 cameras triggered simultaneously. I grabbed my headlamp and spotlight, unzipped my tent, and shined my light toward the game trail. For just a moment, maybe 3 seconds, I saw it. A massive bipedal figure, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The body structure was humanoid but more heavily muscled, especially through the shoulders and arms. It turned its head toward my spotlight, and I caught a glimpse of a face that was simultaneously ape-like and disturbingly human, with deep-set eyes that reflected my light with an amber glow. Then it moved, and the speed at which something that large could disappear into the forest defied everything I knew about biomechanics and locomotion. No bear could move that fast. No human could be that tall. No known primate species existed in North America. I did not sleep the rest of that night. I sat in my tent with every light I had turned on, watching the forest through my tent's mesh window, waiting for dawn with a mixture of terror and exhilaration that probably would have concerned any mental health professional. When sunrise finally came, I immediately went to check the cameras and collect the SD cards. The footage from that night would either validate what I had seen or prove I had hallucinated from stress or lack of sleep. What I found on those cards changed my entire understanding of what might be living in these mountains. 5 of the 6 cameras had captured usable footage. The videos showed the same massive figure I had glimpsed in my spotlight, moving through the area with what appeared to be curiosity rather than aggression. It approached each camera, examined them from different angles, reached out with long arms to touch them but did not destroy them. The creature's hands were clearly visible in several frames, showing 5 fingers with proportions between human and ape, covered in the same dark hair that covered its body. The most striking footage came from the camera mounted highest, which captured a full-body shot of the creature standing upright next to a tree I had measured earlier at 15 feet tall. The creature's head reached approximately 8 feet. Its shoulders were broader than any human bodybuilder, and its arms hung lower than human proportions would allow, reaching past its knees. I spent the entire day reviewing that footage frame by frame, taking measurements based on known references in the images, documenting every detail I could observe. The creature's gait was bipedal, but with a slightly bent knee posture that distributed weight differently than human walking. The hair length varied across its body, shorter on the face and longer on the back and shoulders. The face, visible in several clear frames when it looked directly at the cameras, showed a prominent brow ridge, a flat nose, and a mouth structure that seemed capable of a wider range of expression than any ape species I had studied. This was either the most sophisticated hoax ever created, or I had documented something that mainstream science insisted did not exist. That evening, I made the difficult decision to hike out early and head directly to the park ranger station at Newfound Gap. I needed to report what I had found, to show this footage to authorities who could properly investigate and protect both the public and this creature if it was real. The ranger on duty, a man named Thomas Kirkland, who looked to be in his late 50s, listened to my account with an expression that shifted from skeptical to resigned as I described what I had witnessed and filmed. When I showed him the footage on my laptop, he watched it 3 times in complete silence before finally speaking. He told me that reports of similar creatures had been filed with the Park Service for decades, going back to at least the 1960s in official records and much earlier in Cherokee accounts from before the park was established. Most rangers knew about these reports. though they were not discussed publicly to avoid creating panic or attracting the kind of attention that would disrupt park operations. There had been 47 documented sightings in the Clingman's Dome area alone over the past 10 years, all describing the same general creature, same size range, same behavioral patterns. The Park Service had even consulted with primatologists and wildlife experts off the record, but nobody could explain what was being seen, and no physical evidence beyond footprints and occasionally hair samples had ever been collected. Kirkland told me that my footage was by far the clearest and most detailed documentation anyone had ever obtained, but he strongly suggested I not publish it or share it publicly. His reasoning was both practical and troubling. If this footage became public, the Clingman's Dome area would be overrun with cryptid hunters, amateur researchers, and thrill seekers, all potentially putting themselves in danger and definitely disrupting the creature's habitat. More concerning, if the creature felt threatened or cornered by increased human presence, there was no way to predict how it might react. It had never shown aggression in any of the documented encounters, but a frightened animal of that size and strength could cause serious harm whether it intended to or not. I left the ranger station with a choice that felt impossible. As a scientist, I wanted to publish this data, to share what I had documented, to contribute to our understanding of biodiversity in North America. But as someone who loved these mountains and the creatures that lived in them, I understood that protecting this discovery might be more important than claiming credit for it. I consulted with Dr. Hendricks, who reviewed the footage and acknowledged it was either genuine documentation of an unknown species or an impossibly perfect hoax. She left the decision to me about whether to include it in my dissertation research or keep it separate from my academic work. In the end, I completed my doctoral research on black bear populations without mentioning the creature I had encountered. I published papers on bear behavior and habitat use that earned me my degree and helped secure a postdoctoral position at a research institution in Oregon. But I kept copies of that footage, stored securely and backed up in multiple locations. I also returned to the Clingman's Dome area every year since then, always in October, always setting up cameras in the same locations, hoping for another glimpse of the creature that had challenged everything I thought I knew about wildlife in these mountains. I have captured additional footage on 3 separate occasions since that first encounter, each time showing the same creature or possibly others like it, always at night, always exhibiting the same curious but non-aggressive behavior toward my cameras. I have shared this footage with a small network of researchers who study similar phenomena, and we have documented parallel cases from multiple locations across North America. The indigenous peoples who lived in these places for thousands of years before European colonization have always maintained that these creatures exist, that they are intelligent and generally avoid human contact, that they deserve respect and protection rather than exploitation. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice by keeping this discovery quiet, by not forcing the scientific establishment to confront evidence that challenges our understanding of North American fauna. But then I think about what would happen to these creatures if their existence became widely known and accepted, how they would be hunted and captured and studied and destroyed by the very process that should protect them. So I keep my footage private, I continue my research in silence, and I sleep with the knowledge that there are still mysteries in these ancient mountains, still creatures that have managed to survive in the shadows while the modern world rushes past them, oblivious and certain that everything has already been discovered and cataloged and explained. At 34, I had spent 12 years working as a detective for the Richmond Police Department before my divorce finalized in March, and I decided I needed a complete break from everything that had defined my life up to that point. The job had consumed me for over a decade. Homicide cases and witness interviews and courtroom testimony filling every waking hour until my wife Sarah finally had enough of the missed dinners and canceled vacations and the way I could never quite turn off the analytical part of my brain that treated every conversation like an interrogation. The through hike seemed like the perfect way to clear my head, to spend months thinking about nothing more complicated than where to camp and whether I had enough water to reach the next shelter. I started at Springer Mountain in late April, and by early June I had made it to Virginia, covering roughly 550 miles at a pace that felt sustainable rather than punishing. Other hikers on the trail had given me the trail name Detective, which I tried to discourage but eventually accepted with resignation. Apparently, I asked too many questions and noticed too many details for people's comfort, habits ingrained from years of police work that I could not quite shut off even when I wanted to. The trail community was generally friendly and supportive, but I found myself naturally gravitating toward solitude, preferring to camp alone rather than at the crowded shelters, where dozens of hikers would gather each evening to share meals and stories. On June 8th, I arrived at Woods Hole Shelter in Central Virginia around 4:30 in the afternoon. The shelter was a standard 3-sided wooden structure with a raised sleeping platform that could accommodate maybe 8 people if everyone squeezed together. A picnic table sat out front near a fire ring, and a creek ran about 50 yards downhill, providing fresh water for filtering. I was the only person there when I arrived, which suited me perfectly. I set up my sleeping pad and bag on the platform, hung my food bag from the bear cable, and started filtering water for dinner while there was still good daylight. The shelter log caught my attention while I was waiting for my freeze-dried meal to rehydrate. Every shelter along the trail had a notebook where hikers could leave messages, document their progress, share trail conditions, or just write random thoughts. Most entries were cheerful and encouraging, but as I flipped through the Woods Hole log, I started noticing a pattern of warnings that seemed oddly specific and urgent. Multiple hikers over the past few months had written things like, "Skip the shelter if you can," "Something feels wrong here," and "Left before dark, trust your instincts." Several pages had been torn out completely, leaving ragged edges in the binding where entries had been deliberately removed. My detective instincts, which I had been trying so hard to suppress, immediately kicked into high gear. I photographed several of the warning entries with my phone, noting the dates and trail names of the people who had written them. Then I hiked the half-mile back down to the road crossing, where a local trail angel named Robert ran a small operation out of his garage, offering hikers cold drinks and occasionally giving rides into the nearest town for resupply. Robert was in his 60s with the weathered skin of someone who spent most of his time outdoors, and he seemed genuinely surprised that I was planning to stay at Woods Hole for the night. When I asked him directly about the shelter's reputation, he got quiet for a long moment before finally telling me what the local community knew, but rarely shared with through hikers. 15 years ago, in July 2010, a drifter named James Cranwell had murdered 2 hikers at Woods Hole Shelter. A young couple from Pennsylvania, both in their early 20s, had been stabbed to death in their sleeping bags while they slept. Cranwell was arrested 3 days later, trying to hitch a ride on Interstate 81, covered in blood and carrying items that belonged to the victims. He was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 30 years, but Virginia's parole system meant he had been released after serving only 15 years. He had gotten out of prison just 8 months ago in October. Robert's story made me uneasy, but what really got my attention was when he mentioned that 3 witnesses who had been at the shelter that night and testified at Cranwell's trial had all later recanted their testimonies or died under circumstances that raised questions. One witness, a woman named Jennifer Torres, had recanted 2 years after the trial, claiming she had been pressured by investigators to identify Cranwell, even though she was not certain it was him she had seen near the shelter. Another witness, a man named David Chen, had died in a single-car accident just 6 months after testifying. his vehicle going off a mountain road in conditions that did not seem severe enough to cause that kind of crash. The third witness had simply disappeared, stopped returning calls from prosecutors, and eventually moved out of state without leaving a forwarding address. I spent the next 3 hours at the public library in a nearby town, using their computers to research the case through news archives and court records. The more I dug, the more inconsistencies I found. The murder weapon, a hunting knife with a distinctive bone handle, had disappeared from the evidence room during the appeals process. The defense attorney who had represented Cranwell had died of a heart attack just weeks before a scheduled evidentiary hearing that might have introduced new DNA evidence. The lead investigator on the case had retired abruptly and moved to Florida, refusing all interview requests from journalists or documentary filmmakers interested in the story. What really troubled me was the timeline. According to the original police reports, Cranwell had been seen at the shelter around 9 p.m., had some kind of confrontation with the victims about space on the sleeping platform, and then left. The murders were estimated to have occurred between 2 and 4 a.m. based on body temperature and rigor mortis, but cell phone records introduced during the trial showed Cranwell making calls from a location roughly 25 miles away at 2:30 a.m. and 3:15 a.m. The prosecution argued he could have hiked back to the shelter in that time frame, committed the murders, and then hiked back out. But anyone with actual trail experience would know that covering 50 miles of mountainous terrain in that time window was essentially impossible, especially in the dark without leaving any trace evidence of his presence. I returned to Woods Hole Shelter that evening around 7 p.m. with more questions than answers. 2 other hikers had arrived in my absence, a couple from Ohio who introduced themselves as Trail Mix and Sunshine. They seemed nervous about staying at the shelter once I mentioned the murders, but they decided the 3 of us together would be safer than camping alone in the woods. We shared a campfire dinner, and they turned in around 9:30, exhausted from a 20-mile day. I stayed up later, ostensibly to enjoy the fire, but really because I could not stop thinking about the case, about the inconsistencies, about the witnesses who had recanted or died or disappeared. At exactly 3:11 in the morning, I woke to the sound of footsteps on the gravel path leading to the shelter. My hand instinctively went to my bear spray, the closest thing to a weapon I carried. A figure emerged from the darkness into the pale moonlight, a thin man in his early 50s wearing worn hiking clothes and carrying a small pack. He climbed onto the shelter platform without saying a word and sat down on the opposite end from where Trail Mix and Sunshine were sleeping, maybe 10 feet from where I lay in my sleeping bag. He just stared at me, his face partially obscured by shadows, but his eyes clearly visible and focused with an intensity that made my skin crawl. We sat like that for at least 20 minutes, neither of us speaking, him just watching me watch him. My training told me not to show fear, to maintain eye contact, to assess whether he was armed or represented an immediate threat. He did not appear to have any weapons in his hands, but his posture was alert and coiled, like someone ready to move quickly if necessary. Finally, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, saying he came back to the shelter every year on the anniversary of what happened here, that he liked to remember what he had done, that he knew who I was and what I used to do for work because he had been watching me since I arrived at the trail crossing yesterday afternoon. Then he told me something that made my blood run cold. There had not been 2 victims that night 15 years ago. There had been 6. The couple from Pennsylvania were just the only 2 whose bodies were found. The other 4 were buried within a mile radius of the shelter, in locations he had scouted weeks before the attacks. He told me he had been hunting hikers along this section of trail for years before that night, that Cranwell had been a convenient scapegoat who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, that the real evidence pointing to the other victims had been destroyed or hidden by people who did not want the full scope of the killings to be known because it would devastate tourism and property values in the region. I kept him talking, asking questions the way I had been trained to do during interrogations, getting him to provide details that could later be verified or used as evidence. He seemed almost eager to share, like he had been waiting for years to tell someone who would actually understand the planning and execution that had gone into his crimes. He described the locations where he had buried the other victims, gave me their names and where they were from, explained how he had targeted solo hikers who were between major towns and less likely to be reported missing immediately. My phone was in my sleeping bag, recording audio the entire time, capturing every word he said. When dawn started to break around 5:30 a.m., he stood up slowly and told me he was going to leave now, that I could do whatever I wanted with the information he had given me, that it did not really matter anymore because he was dying of liver cancer and would be dead within 3 months, regardless of whether he spent that time in prison or free. Then he climbed down from the shelter platform and walked back down the trail, disappearing into the morning mist. Trail mix and sunshine had slept through the entire encounter, never waking despite our conversation. I called the Virginia State Police immediately, played them the recording, and gave them detailed descriptions of everything the man had told me. They took it seriously enough to send investigators and cadaver dogs to the locations he had specified. Over the next 2 weeks, they recovered the remains of 4 individuals who had been reported missing between 2008 and 2010, all matching the descriptions the man had given me. His name was Raymond Walsh, a local resident who lived in a cabin about 6 miles from the trail and had been known to trail angels and hikers as someone who sometimes offered rides or trail magic. He was arrested attempting to cross into West Virginia and charged with 4 counts of murder. The investigation revealed that Walsh had indeed been diagnosed with terminal liver cancer and had approximately 4 months to live. The evidence room irregularities, the death of Cranwell's defense attorney, the pressure on witnesses to identify Cranwell, all of it appeared to be part of a broader effort by local officials to close the case quickly and avoid the economic impact of a prolonged investigation into a serial killer targeting the trail. James Cranwell's conviction was overturned, and he was released from prison, though 15 years of his life had been stolen by a system that prioritized convenience over justice. I testified at Walsh's trial in September, 6 months after that night at the shelter. He died in custody 2 weeks before sentencing, the cancer taking him faster than the doctors had predicted. The families of his 4 additional victims finally had answers and closure, though nothing could return the years they had spent not knowing what happened to their loved ones. Woods Hole Shelter was demolished and rebuilt at a different location 2 miles north, and the old site was officially closed and removed from trail maps. I completed my through hike at Mount Katahdin in October, but the experience had changed something fundamental in me. I could not return to police work after that, could not stomach the idea of working within a system that had so thoroughly failed both the victims and an innocent man who spent 15 years in prison. I still check in with the families sometimes, still follow developments in cases where evidence suggests wrongful convictions might be keeping the real perpetrators free. The detective instincts never really go away, but now I use them differently, searching for truth rather than convictions, for justice rather than just closure. At 31, I had been working as a freelance photographer for nearly 8 years, specializing in landscape and nature photography that I sold through stock agencies and occasionally to outdoor magazines. The work was fulfilling but isolating, requiring me to spend weeks at a time alone in remote locations, waiting for perfect light conditions and weather patterns. My October assignment was to document the fall foliage along the North Carolina section of the Appalachian Trail, specifically the area around Max Patch, a massive open bald mountain that offered 360-degree views of the surrounding peaks. The images were commissioned by a regional tourism board that wanted fresh promotional material for their winter marketing campaign, and they were paying well enough that I could afford to take my time and capture the best possible shots. I started the assignment on October 12th, hiking into Max Patch from the parking area with my full photography kit, which added an extra 15 pounds to an already heavy pack. The weather forecast predicted clear skies for at least 5 days, perfect conditions for the kind of dramatic sunrise and sunset images the client wanted. Max Patch itself was stunning, a treeless summit covered in grass that turned golden in autumn, offering unobstructed views that extended for miles in every direction. I set up my base camp on the northern side of the bald, just below the tree line where I would have some wind protection but could still access the summit quickly for dawn and dusk shooting. The first odd occurrence happened on my second morning, October 14th, around 6:30 a.m., as I was hiking up to the summit to photograph sunrise. An elderly man was standing at the highest point, silhouetted against the dawn sky, wearing what looked like extremely outdated hiking gear from the 1970s. Heavy canvas pack, wool clothing, leather boots that looked more suited to work than recreation. I called out a greeting, but he did not respond, just stood there facing east as the sun broke over the distant ridgeline. I set up my tripod about 50 feet away and started shooting, and when I looked up from my camera a minute later to adjust my position, he was gone. Just vanished, despite the fact that the summit was completely open, and I would have seen him walking away in any direction. Over the next 3 days, I encountered the same man repeatedly, always at exactly the same locations along the trail. He would appear precisely 0.3 miles ahead of wherever I was hiking, visible for maybe 30 seconds before disappearing around a bend or behind trees. Each time I tried to catch up to him, increasing my pace to close the distance, he would be gone by the time I reached the spot where I had seen him. The encounters followed an impossible pattern. I would see him ahead on the northbound trail, then hike south for 2 miles to reach a different viewpoint, and somehow he would appear ahead of me again on a completely different section of trail. No one could move that fast or predict my movements with that kind of accuracy unless they were tracking me somehow, and even then the logistics made no sense. On October 17th, I mentioned the encounters to 2 other hikers I met at a water source near Max Patch. Their reaction was immediate and visceral. The woman, who introduced herself as Firefly, actually took a step back from me, and her expression shifted from friendly to fearful. Her hiking partner, a man called Nomad, asked me to describe exactly what the old man looked like, what he was wearing, where I had seen him. When I finished my description, they exchanged a look that clearly communicated shared knowledge of something they were reluctant to discuss. Finally, Firefly told me about Old Tom. According to the story, which both hikers insisted was documented fact rather than legend, a man named Thomas Garrett had worked as a ranger in this section of the Appalachians during the 1970s. He was known for his dedication to helping hikers, often going far beyond his official duties to ensure people were safe and prepared for changing weather conditions. In February 1978, during an unusually severe winter storm, Tom had gone out to check on a group of college students who had reported via radio that they were camping near Max Patch and running low on supplies. He never returned from that rescue attempt. His body was found 3 days later at the summit of Max Patch, frozen solid in a sitting position facing east. The college students were found alive at their campsite, having survived the storm by rationing what little food they had left. Since Tom's death, hundreds of hikers had reported seeing him on the trail around Max Patch, always appearing before major weather events, always moving ahead of hikers as if leading them somewhere safer. Firefly said she had seen him herself 2 years ago, just hours before. A flash flood that washed out sections of the trail and trapped several hikers who had ignored warnings to evacuate the area. Nomad had spoken to at least a dozen other thru hikers who reported identical encounters. Always the same elderly man in outdated gear, always silent, always appearing and disappearing in ways that defied physical explanation. I am a rational person by nature and training. My work as a photographer had taught me to observe carefully, to distinguish between what is actually there and what the mind wants to see or expects to see. I did not believe in ghosts or spirits or any supernatural explanation for phenomena that could likely be explained by coincidence or misperception. But I also could not deny what I had witnessed repeatedly over the past 5 days, so I decided to do what I do best. I would photograph him, capture clear evidence that would either prove he was a real person playing some elaborate game or show something that could not be easily explained away. On October 18th, I positioned myself at a location where I had seen the figure appear 3 times previously, set up my camera with a 400mm telephoto lens, and waited. At approximately 11:20 a.m., he appeared exactly where I expected, standing at a trail junction about 300 yards away. I shot a full sequence of images using rapid continuous shooting mode to capture multiple frames per second. Through my viewfinder, I could see him clearly, could make out details of his face and clothing, but something was wrong with how the image looked. He appeared somehow translucent, like I could see the trees behind him through his body. I kept shooting, thinking maybe it was an optical effect caused by atmospheric conditions or heat shimmer, but the translucent quality remained consistent across dozens of frames. That afternoon, back at my camp, I reviewed the images on my laptop. What I saw made my hands shake as I clicked through the sequence. The figure was there in every frame, exactly as I had seen him through the viewfinder, but he was definitely translucent, with trees and rocks clearly visible through his form. In several frames, where he was standing directly in front of a large pine tree, I could see the tree's bark pattern continuing through his chest and torso. This was not a camera malfunction or a double exposure. This was something that should not be possible according to any physical laws I understood. That evening, the weather changed dramatically. The forecast had predicted clear conditions for another 3 days, but by 8 p.m., dark clouds were building rapidly from the west, and the temperature was dropping faster than normal for October. By 10 p.m., it was snowing heavily, and by midnight, I was in the middle of a full blizzard with whiteout conditions and wind that threatened to flatten my tent. This was not supposed to happen. Early October snowstorms at this elevation were extremely rare, maybe once or twice per decade, and the forecast had given no indication this was coming. At 3:27 a.m., I woke to find my tent partially collapsed from snow weight and my body temperature dropping despite my winter-rated sleeping bag. I was experiencing the early stages of hypothermia, my thinking becoming fuzzy, and my movement sluggish. I knew I needed to get to lower elevation or find better shelter, but in the whiteout conditions, with 2 feet of fresh snow already on the ground, trying to navigate in the dark would be suicidal. I was preparing to accept that I might not survive until morning when I saw a light outside my tent. Not a flashlight beam, but a softer glow that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I unzipped my tent and saw old Tom standing maybe 10 feet away, clearly visible despite the blizzard. That same translucent quality I had photographed earlier, but now somehow more solid, more present. He did not speak, but he turned and began walking into the storm, moving at a pace I could match despite my hypothermic state. I grabbed my pack and followed him, no longer questioning whether this made sense or whether I was hallucinating. He led me down from Mac's Patch, taking a route that I had not known existed, moving through the forest with certainty despite the zero visibility conditions. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes, we emerged at a small wooden structure I had never seen on any trail map or mentioned in any guidebook. It was an old Forest Service cabin, abandoned and forgotten, with a metal roof and walls solid enough to provide real shelter from the storm. Tom stood at the door until I went inside, and then he simply faded away, becoming less distinct with each passing second until he was gone completely, and I was alone in the cabin with the storm raging outside. I survived that night by breaking apart some old furniture to feed a fire in the cabin's wood stove, getting my core temperature back up, and waiting for dawn. When morning came and the storm began to clear, I used my satellite phone to call for help. The rescue team that arrived 6 hours later was shocked to find me at the cabin. According to the rangers, this structure had been decommissioned in 1979 and removed from all official maps. It had been Tom Garrett's ranger station during his years of service. They had assumed it had collapsed decades ago and had no idea it was still standing. When I showed them the route Tom had led me down, they confirmed it was not a maintained trail and would have been nearly impossible to find in a blizzard without prior knowledge of its exact location. I showed the rangers my photographs of Tom, the ones that clearly showed his translucent form. They were not surprised. One of the older rangers, a man named Morris, who had worked in these mountains for 35 years, told me that the Park Service had an unofficial file of Tom Garrett sightings going back to 1979, with dozens of documented cases of hikers reporting encounters that had occurred just before dangerous weather conditions. Morris believed Tom was still out there, still doing his job, still protecting hikers who found themselves in danger on his mountain. I completed my photography assignment and delivered the landscape images to my client, but I kept the photographs of Tom separate, showed them only to researchers and paranormal investigators who might understand their significance. I returned to Max Patch the following spring, in May, and left a memorial plaque near the summit dedicated to Ranger Thomas Garrett, thanking him for his continued service protecting hikers in these mountains. Other hikers have since reported seeing the plaque and leaving their own tributes, creating an informal memorial that the Park Service has allowed to remain despite its unofficial status. I still see Tom sometimes when I am photographing in the southern Appalachians, always at a distance, always before weather turns dangerous. I consider him a guardian of these mountains, proof that some forms of dedication and duty persist beyond death. The photographs remain the most compelling evidence I have ever captured of something that exists outside our normal understanding of reality, and they have fundamentally changed how I view the world and what might lie beyond our ability to fully explain or comprehend. At 38, I'd been out of the military for 4 years, but Afghanistan still followed me home in ways the VA psychiatrist said were textbook PTSD symptoms. Nightmares that woke me at 3:00 a.m. drenched in sweat, hypervigilance that made grocery shopping feel like walking through a combat zone, and an inability to relax around crowds that had effectively ended my marriage and most of my friendships. My therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen, suggested wilderness therapy after the medication. Cocktails failed to give me more than a few hours of sleep per night. She said something about how the structured solitude of long-distance hiking could help reset nervous systems overloaded by trauma. I was skeptical, but I was also desperate enough to try anything that did not involve more pills or more talking about things I did not want to remember. I started my section hike of the Virginia portion of the Appalachian Trail in mid-September, entering at Rockfish Gap, and planning to hike roughly 100 miles north over 3 weeks. The first week went better than I expected. The physical exhaustion from hiking 12 to 15 miles per day actually helped me sleep, and the absence of people and noise felt like medicine in a way the prescriptions never had. I wild camped most nights, avoiding the shelters where other hikers congregated, preferring to set up my tent in isolated spots where I could hear anyone approaching long before they got close. Old habits from patrol duty, scanning perimeters, and identifying threats, but at least out here the threats were mostly imaginary, rather than waiting with IEDs or sniper rifles. Everything changed on the night of September 23rd, my 18th day on the trail. I had camped near Pearisburg in a dispersed site about half a mile off the main trail, tucked into a clearing surrounded by dense forest. I woke at 2:47 a.m. to a voice calling my name. Not shouting, just speaking conversationally, like someone standing just outside my tent trying to get my attention without startling me. The voice was my brother Marcus's voice, identical in tone and inflection, impossible to mistake for anyone else. except Marcus had been dead for 6 years, killed in Helmand Province when his convoy hit an IED that turned his vehicle into shrapnel and flames. I lay in my sleeping bag, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, telling myself this was a dream or a PTSD hallucination or some combination of exhaustion and stress manifesting as auditory phenomena. Dr. Chen had warned me that isolation could sometimes intensify symptoms rather than alleviate them. I did not unzip my tent. I did not respond. I just lay there in the darkness, waiting for my heart rate to return to something approaching normal, waiting for dawn to prove that nothing was actually out there. But the voice came again the next night, and the night after that, always between 2:00 and 4:00 a.m., always calling my name in Marcus's voice, sometimes from what seemed like miles away in the forest, sometimes from just beyond my tent wall. On the fourth night, September 26th, I tried recording it with my phone, holding the device outside my tent while the voice called to me from somewhere in the darkness. But when I played back the recording in the morning, there was nothing but wind noise and the occasional rustle of leaves. No voice at all, despite the fact that I had heard it clearly enough to make out individual words. I called Dr. Chen using my satellite phone on September 27th, explaining what was happening and asking if this was a known manifestation of PTSD, if other veterans experienced auditory hallucinations this specific and persistent. She was concerned enough to suggest I evacuate the trail immediately and return for evaluation, worried that the isolation was triggering a psychotic episode. But something about the experience did not feel like hallucination. The voice was too consistent, too detailed, too interactive in ways that my own subconscious should not be able to generate. On the night of September 29th, the voice changed its pattern. Instead of just calling my name, it started speaking in full sentences, sharing memories that only Marcus and I knew about. Details from our childhood in Montana, inside jokes from our teenage years, specific conversations we had during his last leave before deploying to Afghanistan. It told me about the time we stole our father's truck when I was 15 and Marcus was 17, drove it into a ditch, and spent an entire day digging it out before our father got home from work. It reminded me of the promise we made to each other before Marcus deployed, that whoever survived would make sure the other's family knew they had been loved and remembered. I finally spoke back, my voice shaking, asking what it wanted, why it was doing this, whether I was losing my mind, or if something impossible was actually happening. The voice responded immediately, telling me it needed my help, that it had information I needed to find, that there was something in Afghanistan at specific coordinates that would answer questions his family had been asking for 6 years. Then it gave me GPS coordinates, a string of numbers that I frantically wrote down in my journal by headlamp light, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold the pen. At 3:41 a.m., the voice spoke one final time, clearer and closer than it had ever been before. It said my full name, Raylan Marcus Hawthorne, using the middle name I shared with my brother, and told me to find what was at those coordinates. Told me that his death had not been what everyone believed. Told me to bring him home. Then the presence. Because by this point, I could not deny that there was some kind of presence out there. Seemed to withdraw, and I was alone in the forest with just the wind and my racing thoughts, and a set of coordinates that might lead nowhere, or might lead to answers that would change everything. I hiked out at first light, not even bothering to pack my camp properly, just stuffing everything into my pack and moving as fast as I could toward the nearest road crossing. I needed internet access, needed to research those coordinates, needed to determine if I was documenting a genuine paranormal experience, or if I was having a mental health crisis that required immediate intervention. The nearest town with Wi-Fi was 12 miles away, and I covered that distance in under 5 hours, barely stopping to drink water or catch my breath. At the public library, I entered the coordinates into Google Earth and felt my stomach drop when I saw what they pointed to. The location was in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, roughly 8 miles from where Marcus's convoy had been hit. It was in an area that had been under Taliban control at the time and had only been secured by coalition forces about 2 years after Marcus's death. I spent the next 4 hours researching military operations in that area, reading after-action reports that had been declassified, and eventually finding a news article from 2021 about the recovery of remains from several coalition service members whose bodies had been taken by Taliban fighters after various attacks. I contacted my brother's commanding officer, Colonel James Reston, who had retired from active duty but still maintained connections with military intelligence and recovery operations. I told him about the coordinates, carefully avoiding any mention of how I had obtained them, simply saying I had received an anonymous tip that there might be remains or evidence at that location. Reston was skeptical, but agreed to pass the information along to the appropriate channels, more out of respect for Marcus's memory than belief that anything would come of it. 3 months later, in December, I received a phone call from the Department of Defense. A recovery team operating in Afghanistan had investigated the coordinates I had provided and discovered the remains of 3 coalition service members in a hidden burial site. One of those sets of remains had been identified through dental records and DNA analysis as belonging to my brother, Staff Sergeant Marcus Hawthorne. The other 2 were soldiers who had been listed as missing in action from separate incidents. All 3 had apparently been captured alive after their initial attacks, held prisoner for an unknown period of time, and executed at this location. The Taliban fighters responsible had buried them in unmarked graves that were only discovered because of the specific coordinates I had provided. The military wanted to know how I had obtained that information, and I told them the truth, knowing it would sound insane but having no better explanation to offer. I described the voice on the trail, the specific details it had shared, the coordinates it had given me. The investigators were professional and polite, but I could see they thought I was either lying about my source or had experienced some kind of psychotic break that had coincidentally led to real information. They did extensive background checks, interrogated me multiple times, searched for any possible way I could have obtained those coordinates through conventional means. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. I had no contacts in military intelligence, no access to classified information, no way to have known about that burial site, except for what the voice had told me. Marcus was brought home in January with full military honors. His remains were buried at the National Cemetery in Helena, Montana, with our parents and his ex-wife and his 2 daughters in attendance. The ceremony provided closure that our family had been denied for 6 years, the ability to finally lay him to rest properly, rather than living with the uncertainty of not knowing what had happened to his body. During the service, as they played taps and folded the flag, I felt a presence beside me, warm and familiar, and I knew without any doubt that Marcus was there, that he had accomplished what he needed to do, that he could finally rest. I never completed my section hike of the Appalachian Trail. The experience near Pearisburg had answered questions I did not know I had been asking, had provided proof that whatever came after death was not simply oblivion, that consciousness or spirit, or whatever we choose to call it, could persist and communicate under circumstances we do not fully understand. Dr. Chen reviewed my account and the subsequent military findings, and she acknowledged that my experience did not fit any standard psychiatric framework, that the verifiable information I received defied conventional explanation. I still have PTSD, still wake up at night sometimes, with my heart racing and my mind convinced I am back in a combat zone. But I also have something I did not have before that night on the trail. I have certainty that Marcus exists somewhere beyond death, that he was able to reach out and provide information that brought him home, that the bond between brothers can transcend physical death, and the limitations we assume define reality. I sleep better now than I have in years, not because the nightmares have stopped, but because I understand that death is not the end, that the people we love remain connected to us in ways that science cannot yet measure, but that are no less real for being unexplainable. At 27, I was finishing my doctoral dissertation in cultural anthropology at Duke University, focusing specifically on how folklore and oral traditions functioned as knowledge transmission systems in isolated Appalachian communities. My research had taken me across North Carolina, Virginia, and Tennessee over the past 2 years, interviewing elderly residents who still remembered stories passed down from their grandparents about supernatural entities that inhabited the mountains. The academic establishment tended to treat these stories as quaint superstitions or metaphorical representations of natural phenomena, but I had developed a different perspective through my fieldwork. These communities had been observing and documenting unexplained occurrences for generations, and their folklore represented a form of empirical knowledge that deserved serious consideration rather than dismissal. In early November, I began a 2-week hiking research trip along the North Carolina section of the Appalachian Trail near the Georgia border, specifically around Standing Indian Mountain. I had been directed to this area by a Cherokee elder named William Crow, whom I had interviewed 3 months earlier at the Eastern Band Cherokee Reservation. William had shared stories about Spearfinger, a creature from Cherokee mythology described as a witch or demon who inhabited rocky areas and used a sharp stone finger to cut open her victims and remove their livers. The name Standing Indian Mountain itself came from a Cherokee legend about a warrior who had been turned to stone while standing watch, and William believed the area still held what he called old power that manifested in ways modern people did not understand or acknowledge. William had warned me specifically about a ravine locals referred to as Witch's Hollow, located approximately 2 miles off the main Appalachian Trail in an area rarely visited by hikers. He told me that people who went there often reported feeling watched, experiencing time distortions where hours passed that they could not account for, and discovering strange symbols carved into rocks that predated known Cherokee settlements in the region. Some who entered the hollow claimed to have no memory of their time there, waking up miles away with unexplained injuries. William's warnings were delivered with absolute seriousness, and he made me promise to bring traditional offerings of tobacco if I insisted on visiting the hollow, to show respect for whatever presence inhabited that space. I reached Standing Indian Mountain on November 7th and spent the first 3 days documenting symbols I found carved into various rock formations in the area. Many matched descriptions from Cherokee oral histories, but some were more abstract, almost geometric patterns that reminded me of symbols I had seen in photographs from Paleolithic cave sites in Europe. On November 10th, I located what I believed was Witch's Hollow, based on Williams' directions and GPS coordinates derived from old survey maps. The ravine was exactly as he had described it, a deep depression in the landscape invisible from the main trail, accessible only by following a barely visible game path that wound through dense forest. The atmosphere in the hollow felt wrong from the moment I entered. The temperature dropped at least 10 degrees, despite no change in elevation or wind conditions. The normal forest sounds, birds and insects and rustling leaves, were completely absent, replaced by a silence so profound it felt oppressive. I found dozens of rock cairns arranged throughout the hollow, some obviously recent, but others so weathered and covered in lichen that they must have been there for decades or longer. The symbols William had described were everywhere, carved into flat rock faces, scratched into tree bark, even formed from arrangements of smaller stones on the ground. I followed William's instructions and left offerings of tobacco at several locations, speaking aloud to announce my presence, and explain that I came as a researcher with respect for this place and whatever inhabited it. Then I set up my camera equipment and began documenting the symbols systematically, photographing each one from multiple angles, taking measurements, making detailed sketches in my field journal. The work was absorbing, and I lost track of time in the way that often happens during intensive fieldwork. What I thought was perhaps 2 hours of work turned out to be much longer than I realized. When I finally checked my watch, expecting it to read around 4 p.m., it showed 9:47 p.m. I'd entered the hollow at 1:30 in the afternoon, according to my time-stamped photographs. More than 8 hours had passed, but I had no memory of anything beyond the first 2 hours of documentation work. My camera's memory card was full, which should not have been possible given that I had installed a fresh 128 gigabyte card that morning. When I reviewed the images on my camera's display screen, I found thousands of photographs I did not remember taking, most showing the same symbols from slightly different angles, as if I had been photographing compulsively without any conscious awareness of doing so. More disturbing was the discovery that I had carved symbols into my own left forearm using a sharp rock I found in my backpack. 3 distinct symbols, each about 2 inches long, cut deep enough to bleed, but precise enough to be clearly legible. I had absolutely no memory of doing this, no recollection of experiencing pain or making any decision to mark my own body. The symbols matched ones I had been photographing throughout the hollow, and when I consulted my reference materials later, I found they corresponded to Cherokee descriptions of marks left by Spearfinger on those she had selected but not yet killed. I left the hollow immediately, hiking by headlamp despite the danger of navigating unfamiliar terrain in darkness. I needed to get away from that place, needed to be around other people, needed to verify that I was still capable of controlling my own actions. The hike back to the main trail took 90 minutes, and I did not stop until I reached a shelter where 4 other hikers were camped for the night. Their presence, their normal conversation about trail conditions and meal planning, helped ground me in reality after the dissociative experience in the hollow. The next morning, I hiked to the nearest town with medical facilities and had the carved symbols examined by a physician at an urgent care clinic. The doctor was more concerned about infection risk than the circumstances under which I had acquired the injuries, and she prescribed antibiotics and recommended I consult a psychiatrist about possible dissociative episodes. I did not tell her the full story because I knew how it would sound, knew she would see me as someone experiencing a psychiatric emergency rather than someone who had encountered something genuinely anomalous. I contacted William Crow via phone the following day and described what had happened, including the lost time, the compulsive photographing, and the carved symbols on my arm. His response was immediate and unequivocal. I'd been marked by Spearfinger, identified as someone who had entered her territory without proper protection despite the warnings I had received. The fact that I had been released rather than killed was significant, William explained, suggesting that the offerings I had left and the respect I had shown had earned me consideration. But the marks would remain, both as scars on my skin and as a connection to that place that would persist for the rest of my life. William insisted on performing a cleansing ceremony, which required me to travel to the reservation and participate in rituals that involved smoke, water, prayer, and the application of specific herbs to the carved symbols. The ceremony took most of a day and was conducted by William and 2 other elders whose names I was told not to share outside the community. They explained that I had been given a choice I did not consciously understand, that Spearfinger had offered to make me one of her watchers, to give me the ability to see and move between worlds in ways humans normally could not. My unconscious acceptance of this offer, demonstrated by carving her symbols into my own flesh, had initiated a process that could not be fully reversed, but could be managed through proper observance and respect. I returned to my academic work, profoundly changed by the experience. I completed my dissertation, but I excluded the events at Witch's Hollow from the published version, knowing that including them would destroy any credibility I had within the academic community. Instead, I documented everything in a separate private journal that I keep for my own records and for future researchers who might be willing to approach these phenomena with openness rather than dismissive skepticism. The symbols carved into my arm healed, but left permanent scars exactly as William had predicted. I have returned to Witch's Hollow once each year since that first encounter, always bringing offerings, always spending several hours in meditation and documentation. Each visit brings new insights, new photographs of symbols that appear in different locations or configurations, new experiences of time distortion, and dissociative states that I have learned to accept as part of whatever relationship I formed with that place and the entity William calls Spearfinger. Other researchers have contacted me after hearing rumors about my experience. Anthropologists and folklorists who have investigated similar phenomena in other Appalachian locations. We share information quietly, outside official academic channels, documenting cases where people have reported being marked or changed by encounters with entities from indigenous folklore. The pattern is consistent across multiple locations and time periods, suggesting these are not isolated psychological experiences, but genuine encounters with something that exists independent of human belief or observation. I currently teach anthropology at a small college in North Carolina, and my research continues to focus on Appalachian folklore and oral traditions. But I approach the material differently than my colleagues, treating the stories not as quaint cultural artifacts, but as accurate descriptions of real phenomena that indigenous communities have been documenting for thousands of years. My students sometimes notice the scars on my arm and ask about them, and I tell them it is a reminder that fieldwork can change you in unexpected ways, that sometimes the things we study claim us just as surely as we claim to study them. The academic establishment will never accept what I experienced as valid evidence of anything beyond psychological aberration. But I know what happened in that hollow, know that I lost 8 hours I can never recover, know that something compelled me to mark my own body with symbols I did not consciously choose. The Cherokee have been right all along about Spearfinger and the other entities they describe in their folklore. These are not metaphors or allegorical representations of natural phenomena. They are real beings that inhabit spaces humans have mostly forgotten how to perceive, and they interact with our world in ways that defy our current scientific frameworks, but are no less genuine for being unexplained. I still experience episodes of lost time, always associated with locations that have similar energy signatures to Witch's Hollow. I have learned to recognize the warning signs, the sudden temperature drops, and the oppressive silence, and the feeling of being observed by something that exists just outside normal perception. When I encounter these signs, I leave offerings and speak words of respect that William taught me. And so far, I have not been harmed or compelled to do anything I cannot live with afterward. But I carry the marks, literal and metaphorical, of that first encounter, and I understand now that there are prices we pay for knowledge that extends beyond the boundaries of what our culture considers acceptable or explainable. At 33, I had been working as a professional wilderness guide for 8 years, leading groups through some of the most challenging terrain in North America. My specialty was week-long guided treks through remote sections of major trails, where clients paid premium rates for my expertise in navigation, wilderness medicine, and risk management. I had guided groups through sections of the Pacific Crest Trail, the Continental Divide Trail, and multiple segments of the Appalachian Trail without any serious incidents. My safety record was spotless, my navigation skills were exceptional, and I carried top-of-the-line GPS equipment, satellite communicators, and backup systems for every critical function. In October, I was hired to lead a group of 4 clients through the 100-mile wilderness section of the Appalachian Trail in Maine, the most remote and challenging stretch of the entire 2,190-mile trail. The group consisted of experienced hikers who had trained specifically for this trip. Michael and Sarah Chen, a married couple in their early 40s from California, both avid backpackers with dozens of multi-day trips under their belts. Jennifer Torres, 38, a marathon runner from Colorado who wanted to test herself in a different kind of endurance environment. And Robert Kirkland, 52, a retired Marine who had hiked portions of the trail in previous years and wanted to complete the 100-mile wilderness before he turned 54 and 5. They were prepared, fit, and mentally ready for the challenge. Everything about the trip planning had gone perfectly, and I had no concerns about our ability to complete the route safely within our scheduled 7 days. We started the southbound trek on October 4th, entering the wilderness from the northern terminus near Baxter State Park. The weather forecast was favorable, with clear skies and temperatures in the 50s during the day, dropping to the 30s at night. Perfect hiking conditions for October in Maine. The first 3 days proceeded exactly according to plan. We covered the expected mileage each day, camped at designated sites, and the group dynamics were positive and cooperative. Everyone was handling the physical demands well, and morale was high. I had guided this exact route twice before and knew every significant landmark, water source, and campsite along the way. On the afternoon of October 7th, day 4 of the trek, we reached a location on my GPS that indicated a side trail leading to a scenic overlook. According to my maps, this side trail was 0.8 miles round trip, a 20-minute hike out to the viewpoint and 20 minutes back. The maps had been updated within the past year, and I had verified the trail's existence through multiple sources before the trip. The group was ahead of schedule and in good spirits, so I suggested we take the short detour to photograph the views before continuing to our planned campsite for the night. Everyone agreed enthusiastically, and we began hiking the clearly marked side trail at approximately 3:15 p.m. The trail was well maintained and easy to follow, winding gently uphill through mixed hardwood forest with occasional glimpses of the valley below. We reached what appeared to be the overlook after about 15 minutes of hiking, took photographs, enjoyed the views, and started back down the same trail we had ascended. The hike down took perhaps 20 minutes, maybe 25 at most. But when we emerged back onto what should have been the main Appalachian Trail, something was fundamentally wrong. The trail junction where we had entered looked nothing like the junction we had left less than an hour earlier. I checked my GPS immediately, and the coordinates showed we were 47 miles north of where we should have been. That was impossible. I reset the GPS, checked for satellite signal errors, verified that the device was functioning properly. Everything indicated we were nearly 50 miles from our last known position, despite having hiked less than 2 miles total on the side trail. Michael suggested my GPS was malfunctioning, that we should simply retrace our route back to the overlook and then back down again, clearly marking our path to avoid any navigation errors. That seemed like the logical approach, so we turned around and hiked back up the side trail. The overlook was still there, exactly as we had left it 30 minutes earlier. But when we examined the photographs on our cameras and phones, comparing the timestamps to our watches, we discovered a discrepancy that made no logical sense. The photographs showed we had been at the overlook at 3:32 p.m., which matched our expectation based on when we had started the side trail. But our watches and phones now showed 9:11 p.m. Nearly 6 hours had passed, but none of us had any memory of those hours. We had experienced what felt like maybe 40 minutes of hiking, but according to every timekeeping device we carried, we had lost almost 6 hours. Sarah started panicking, hyperventilating, and insisting that this could not be happening. The time did not just disappear. Jennifer was trying to maintain calm, but I could see the fear in her eyes. The realization that something had occurred that we could not explain or understand. Robert, drawing on his military training, stayed focused and asked the practical questions. Did anyone feel drugged or disoriented? Did anyone have any memory at all of the missing hours? Had we been unconscious? The answer to all those questions was no. We felt fine physically, just confused and increasingly frightened by the implications of what was happening. I activated our satellite emergency beacon, sending a distress signal that would alert search and rescue to our situation. According to the GPS coordinates the beacon transmitted, we were at the location my handheld unit indicated, roughly 47 miles north of where we had entered the side trail. The response came back within 20 minutes, confirming our coordinates and asking about the nature of our emergency. I explained as clearly as I could that we had experienced a spatial displacement we could not account for, that we appeared to have covered nearly 50 miles in a time period that should have been less than an hour, and that we had no memory of how we had gotten to our current location. The search and rescue coordinator asked if anyone in the group was injured or experiencing medical distress. When I confirmed that we were all physically fine but psychologically shaken, he told us to make camp at our current location and wait for a team to reach us by morning. He also mentioned, and his tone when he said this suggested he was choosing his words carefully, that we were not the first group to report a spatial anomaly in the 100-mile wilderness. There had been other incidents over the years, though he could not provide details over the radio. We made camp that night in a state of controlled panic, setting up tents and preparing dinner through force of habit and training rather than any real desire to eat or sleep. No one wanted to discuss what had happened, but no one could think about anything else. Robert suggested that perhaps we had all experienced some kind of shared hallucination or mass psychogenic event triggered by environmental factors like carbon monoxide or naturally occurring psychoactive compounds in the air. But that did not explain the GPS coordinates, the timestamps on our photographs, or the fact the search and rescue had confirmed our location based on the satellite beacon. The rescue team reached us at approximately 10 a.m. the following morning, October 8th. They consisted of 3 experienced wilderness rescue specialists and a park ranger named Catherine Morris, who specialized in search operations in the 100-mile wilderness. They conducted medical evaluations of all 5 of us, checking for signs of head trauma, drug exposure, dehydration, hypothermia, or any physical condition that might explain altered mental states or memory loss. We were all completely healthy, showing no signs of any medical issues whatsoever. Ranger Morris then sat down with us individually and as a group, asking detailed questions about exactly what we had experienced, where we had entered the side trail, what the overlook had looked like, what we remembered or did not remember. After these interviews, she shared information that was not generally publicized, but that the Park Service had been documenting for over 30 years. There had been 14 previous incidents in the 100-mile wilderness involving hikers who reported entering side trails or taking short detours and emerging at locations significantly distant from where they should have been. All incidents involved similar time distortions, with hikers missing hours or sometimes days that they could not account for. One hiker in 1994 had entered a side trail and never emerged at all, simply vanished without any trace despite extensive search operations. The area contained unusual magnetic anomalies that had been documented by geological surveys but never adequately explained. Compass readings were frequently unreliable in certain sections, and electronic devices sometimes malfunctioned in ways that suggested powerful electromagnetic interference. Ranger Morris theorized, though she emphasized this was speculation rather than established fact, that certain locations in the wilderness might be affected by temporal or spatial distortions related to the magnetic anomalies. She had no scientific explanation for how or why this occurred, but the pattern of incidents suggested that something reproducible and consistent was happening in these locations. We were evacuated from the wilderness that afternoon, hiking out to the nearest road access point with the rescue team. Over the following weeks, we all underwent extensive medical and psychological evaluations. The doctors found nothing physically wrong with any of us. The psychiatrists diagnosed us with shared trauma response to an unexplained event, but they could not explain the objective evidence of our displacement, the GPS coordinates, the timestamps, the confirmed location of our emergency beacon activation. I retired from wilderness, guiding immediately after that trip. I could not, in good conscience, continue leading people into environments where I could not guarantee their safety or even their ability to navigate through space and time in predictable ways. My clients from that trip have all remained in contact, forming a bond through our shared experience of something that should not be possible according to any physical laws we understand. Michael and Sarah both developed persistent anxiety about hiking, particularly in remote areas. Jennifer completed her planned marathons, but has never returned to long-distance backpacking. Robert continues to hike, but only in well-trafficked areas where other people are always visible. The Park Service officially classified our incident report as unexplained spatial displacement with associated temporal anomaly. The side trail we entered has since been investigated multiple times, but research teams have been unable to reproduce the effect or determine what causes it. The trail remains accessible and appears on maps, though hikers are now warned through unofficial channels to avoid taking any unmarked or poorly documented side trails in the 100-mile wilderness, particularly in areas where magnetic anomalies have been recorded. I still dream about those missing 6 hours, wondering what happened during that time we cannot remember, wondering if we walked those 47 miles in some altered state of consciousness, or if we were transported through space by some mechanism we do not understand. Photographs on our cameras show only the overlook and our campsite that night, nothing in between. No record of how we moved from one location to another. I have spoken with researchers who study similar phenomena in other locations around the world, places where space and time seem to behave differently than our physics predicts. No one has adequate explanations, only more documentation of impossible events. What disturbs me most is not the spatial displacement itself, but the missing time. 6 hours of our lives simply gone, with no memory, no trace, no way to recover what happened during those hours. We were somewhere, experiencing something, but that experience has been completely erased from our conscious memory. Sometimes I wonder if forgetting is a mercy, if whatever happened during those 6 hours is something our minds have protected us from remembering. And sometimes I wake at 3 a.m. terrified that one day the memories will return, and I will understand what really happened on that side trail in the 100-mile wilderness of Maine. At 29, I had been hiking solo for nearly 5 years, having built up my experience gradually from day hikes to weekend trips to the multi-week expeditions I now preferred. I worked as a freelance web developer, which allowed me to take extended time off whenever I wanted, and the solitary nature of my work translated naturally into a preference for solitary hiking. I had dealt with a stalking situation 2 years earlier in Portland that had made me hyper-vigilant about personal safety, but I had worked through that trauma with a therapist and refused to let fear prevent me from doing the things I loved. The Appalachian Trail had always appealed to me because of its well-established trail community, the network of shelters and towns that provided regular checkpoints, and the general reputation for being safer than more isolated wilderness areas. In mid-August, I started a section hike through Pennsylvania, planning to cover roughly 230 miles over 3 weeks. The Pennsylvania section had a reputation for being rocky and challenging, but also for having excellent trail angel support, with locals who regularly helped hikers with rides to town for resupply or offered their homes for showers and laundry. During my first week on the trail, I met dozens of helpful people, including a man named Marcus, who introduced himself at a trail crossing near Duncannon. He was in his late 40s, friendly and talkative, with a pickup truck parked nearby and a cooler full of cold sodas that he was offering to passing hikers. Marcus seemed harmless, the kind of enthusiastic trail angel that the hiking community depended on. He chatted with me about trail conditions ahead, warned me about a particularly rocky section coming up, and offered to give me a ride into town if I needed supplies. I declined politely, explaining that I had plenty of food and water for the next several days. Other hikers at the crossing vouched for Marcus, saying he had been helping through hikers for years, that his trail magic was legendary, that he was one of the good ones who genuinely cared about the hiking community. I relaxed my guard based on these endorsements, accepting a cold Coke and sitting on his tailgate to rest my feet for 20 minutes while we talked. What I did not notice at the time, what I only recognized later when reviewing my photographs, was that Marcus had taken pictures of me while I was drinking the soda and looking at my trail map. In one of my landscape photos that accidentally captured part of the parking area, you can see him in the background holding up his phone, clearly photographing me without permission. At the time, I attributed his attention to normal trail angel friendliness, the kind of person who enjoys meeting hikers and hearing their stories. I thanked him for the soda and continued hiking north, thinking nothing more of our encounter. 3 days later, I ran into Marcus again at a different trail crossing, nearly 40 miles from where we had first met. He acted surprised to see me, said he had been visiting family in the area, and decided to check if any hikers needed help. He again offered me a ride to the nearest town for resupply, and this time I accepted because I was running low on certain items and the town was only 6 miles from the trail. During the drive, I noticed he had several photographs clipped to his sun visor, all showing young women who appeared to be hikers based on their gear and the outdoor settings. When I asked about them, he said they were hikers he had helped over the years, that he liked to keep photos as memories of the people he had met. Something about those photos made me uncomfortable in a way I could not immediately articulate. They all showed women who resembled me physically, similar age range, similar build, similar features, but I pushed down the unease, telling myself I was being paranoid, that my past experience with stalking was making me see threats where none existed. Marcus dropped me at the outfitter in town, gave me his phone number in case I needed a ride back to the trail, and drove away. I did my resupply, stayed at a hostel that night, and arranged for a shuttle back to the trail the next morning through the hostel owner rather than calling Marcus. Over the next 4 days, I saw Marcus 3 more times at different locations along the trail. Each encounter seemed coincidental at first, but the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. He always had a reason for being there, always acted surprised to see me, always offered help that seemed genuine and well-intentioned. But the frequency of these encounters, given the distances involved and the random timing, started to feel orchestrated rather than accidental. On August 23rd, I arrived at the hostel in Pine Grove Furnace State Park and mentioned the repeated encounters to the hostel owner, a woman named Carol, who had been running the place for over a decade. Carol's expression changed immediately when I described Marcus and his truck. She asked me specific questions about what he looked like, what he had said, whether he had offered rides or taken photographs. Then she told me something that made my blood run cold. 3 female hikers had reported Marcus to local authorities over the past 2 years, all describing similar patterns of repeated encounters, unsolicited rides, uncomfortable attention that escalated gradually over time. One woman had found a GPS tracker hidden in her backpack after Marcus had offered to help her adjust her pack straps. Another had been followed to her campsite and woke to find him standing outside her tent at 2:00 a.m., claiming he was just checking to make sure she was safe. Carol insisted I report my encounters to the state police immediately, and she called them herself while I searched through my backpack for anything that might have been placed there without my knowledge. I found it tucked into a small exterior pocket I rarely used, a tiny GPS tracking device no bigger than a matchbook, the kind marketed for tracking valuable items or elderly family members. The device was active and had been recording my location data for the past 11 days, since the day after my first encounter with Marcus at the trail crossing near Duncannon. The state police arrived within 45 minutes and took detailed statements about every interaction I had had with Marcus. They photographed the GPS tracker, documented where it had been hidden in my pack, and asked if Marcus had ever touched my gear or been in a position to access it without my knowledge. I remembered that at the hostel, where I had stayed after accepting the ride, I had left my pack on the porch while I went inside to shower. Marcus had still been in the parking lot when I went in, had waved, and driven away shortly after. He could easily have accessed my pack during those 15 or 20 minutes. The investigating officer, Detective Sarah Brennan, told me that Marcus had been on their radar for several years, but they had never had enough evidence to arrest him. The GPS tracker changed everything, providing clear proof of stalking and illegal surveillance. They also wanted to search his property based on the pattern of behavior described by multiple victims. Detective Brennan strongly suggested I stay in town under police protection, rather than returning to the trail until Marcus was located and arrested. The thought of abandoning my hike because of someone else's criminal behavior made me angry, but the thought of encountering Marcus again while alone in the wilderness made me terrified. That night, August 23rd, at 3:22 a.m., I woke in my hostel room to my phone buzzing with an emergency alert. Marcus had been arrested at the hostel, attempting to enter the building through a rear door that he had somehow unlocked or propped open earlier. He was carrying zip ties, duct tape, and a knife. The hostel had security cameras that captured him arriving in his truck at 2:45 a.m., parking down the street and approaching the building on foot. Carol had woken to sounds of someone trying the door handles and had immediately called 911 while activating the alarm system Marcus had not known existed. The search of Marcus's property the following day revealed evidence that would become the foundation for multiple criminal charges. His basement contained items from at least 11 different female hikers spanning 5 years, meticulously organized, and labeled with dates and locations where he had acquired them. Clothing, hiking gear, personal items like journals and toiletries, even unwashed coffee mugs and water bottles. He had photographs of dozens of women, surveillance-style images taken without knowledge or consent, many showing women at campsites or shelters in various states of undress. Most disturbing was a detailed notebook documenting the routines, habits, schedules, and vulnerabilities of specific women he had targeted. DNA evidence collected from some of the items linked Marcus to 2 unsolved sexual assault cases from 2021 and 2023, both involving female hikers in Pennsylvania who had accepted rides from a helpful trail angel matching Marcus's description. Neither victim had been able to identify their attacker definitively because he had worn a mask and attacked at night, but physical evidence collected during the investigations matched Marcus's DNA profile. Additional investigation revealed he had been using multiple names and operating in different states along the Appalachian Trail corridor, with similar complaints filed in Virginia, West Virginia, and Maryland over a 7-year period. Marcus's real name was David Allen Wright, and his criminal history extended back to his early 20s, with convictions for voyeurism, trespassing, and harassment that had escalated over time to more serious offenses. He had served a 3-year sentence for aggravated stalking in 2009, but had been released early for good behavior. The trail angel persona had been a calculated strategy to gain access to vulnerable women who were often alone, far from support systems, and conditioned by trail culture to trust helpful strangers. I testified at his trial in November, along with 4 other women who had similar experiences with Marcus in different years and locations. My testimony about the GPS tracker and the attempted break-in at the hostel, combined with the physical evidence from his property and the DNA matches to the assault cases, resulted in convictions on 14 separate charges, including stalking, assault, attempted kidnapping, and illegal surveillance. He was sentenced to 25 years without the possibility of parole. though given his age and health issues, the judge acknowledged he would likely die in prison. The experience fundamentally changed how I approach hiking and wilderness travel. I completed the Pennsylvania section after Marcus's arrest, but I never hiked alone again. I joined hiking groups, coordinated my schedule with other solo hikers so we could camp within sight of each other, and became an advocate for improved safety protocols in the trail community. The culture of unconditional trust in trail angels and helpful strangers has to be balanced with awareness that predators specifically target environments where people are isolated and vulnerable. The Appalachian Trail Conservancy implemented new screening and identification protocols for official trail angels following Marcus's arrest and the revelation of how long he had been operating. But unofficial trail angels, people who simply show up at trail crossings or post online about helping hikers, remain largely unvetted and unknown. I work with trail organizations now to educate hikers, particularly solo women, about recognizing red flags in behavior, about trusting their instincts even when someone seems helpful, about understanding that predators often present as the most trustworthy and helpful people precisely because that persona grants them access to victims. I still carry the GPS tracker that Marcus planted in my pack, now deactivated and kept as a reminder that the wilderness itself is rarely the greatest danger hikers face. Human predators who understand how to exploit trust and isolation are far more dangerous than any animal or weather event. I check my gear obsessively now, looking for devices or items that do not belong. I photograph every trail angel I interact with and send those photos to friends with timestamps and locations. I verify identities through trail community forums before accepting rides or help from strangers. These precautions have probably saved my life or prevented assaults on multiple occasions since, though I will never know for certain how many encounters with seemingly helpful people were actually encounters with predators. The hiking community has become more aware and cautious since Marcus's case became public, but there is still resistance to the idea that we need to be suspicious of people who present as helpful and friendly. The culture of trail magic and unconditional kindness is central to the Appalachian Trail experience, and many hikers resist anything that threatens that culture. But I survived my encounter with Marcus because I eventually listened to the unease I felt, because Carol at the hostel recognized the pattern and took action, because law enforcement had been documenting his behavior even though they had not yet been able to stop him. Other women were not as fortunate, and their experiences deserve to be remembered and used to protect future hikers from predators who use the trail community's trust against them. At 25, I was in my second year of a PhD program in zoology at Virginia Tech, conducting research on predator-prey dynamics in isolated mountain ecosystems. My dissertation focused specifically on how apex predators like black bears and coyotes adapted their hunting behaviors in response to human encroachment on wilderness areas. The fieldwork required extensive time in remote locations, setting up camera traps, collecting scat samples, and documenting animal behavior through direct observation and tracking. I had grown up in rural Wyoming, the daughter of a wildlife veterinarian and a park ranger, so I had been around wild animals my entire life and had developed what I considered a healthy respect for their capabilities, while maintaining a scientist's skepticism about folklore and unverified reports of unknown species. In late September, I began a 3-week research project in the Tennessee section of the Appalachian Trail near Cherokee National Forest, specifically in the area surrounding Clingman's Dome and the surrounding ridges. This region was known for healthy populations of black bears and had recently seen an increase in livestock predation on farms that bordered the national forest, with several incidents involving kills that showed unusual patterns. The farmers claimed the attacks were being carried out by something much larger than a typical black bear, something that moved on 2 legs and left tracks that did not match any known species. Local wildlife officials had dismissed these reports as misidentifications or exaggerations, but they had asked my advisor to send a graduate student to conduct a proper assessment and document what was actually killing the livestock. I arrived at the research area on September 22nd and spent the first 4 days setting up a network of trail cameras along game trails, near water sources, and at locations where the livestock kills had occurred. I had brought professional-grade equipment including thermal imaging cameras, motion-activated video recorders, and audio recording devices that could capture vocalizations across a wide frequency range. I also documented the livestock kill sites that were still accessible, taking measurements of claw marks, bite patterns, and drag marks to compare against known predator behavior patterns for bears, mountain lions, and large canines. The evidence at the kill sites was immediately troubling from a scientific perspective. The claw marks on several of the dead cattle and sheep showed 5 distinct parallel gouges, which was consistent with bear claws, but the spacing between the marks suggested a paw significantly larger than any black bear on record in Tennessee. The measurements indicated a paw width of approximately 9 inches compared to the typical 6-inch width of an adult male black bear. More unusual was the drag pattern showing that at least one of the cattle, which had weighed approximately 800 pounds according to the farmer, had been moved nearly 200 yards uphill from the pasture where it was killed. Black bears can drag prey, but moving an 800-pound carcass the distance over that terrain would require an animal with extraordinary strength. On the evening of September 26th, I was reviewing footage from my trail cameras at my base camp, about 2 miles from the nearest farm. One of the thermal cameras, positioned near a creek that multiple game trails converged on, had captured something at 3:17 a.m. that made me replay the footage a dozen times trying to understand what I was seeing. The thermal signature showed a large bipedal figure, approximately 8 feet tall based on the reference markers I had placed in the frame, approaching the creek and kneeling to drink. The heat signature was consistent with a large mammal, showing clear temperature differentiation between the body core and extremities. But the body proportions were wrong for a human, with shoulders that were far too broad and arms that hung proportionally lower than human anatomy would allow. I spent the next day examining that location in person, finding massive tracks pressed into the mud near the creek. The tracks measured 18 inches in length and showed 5 distinct toe impressions, arranged in a pattern that was humanoid rather than ursine. The depth of the impressions, given the soil consistency, suggested something weighing between 400 and 600 pounds. I made plaster casts of the best prints, took dozens of photographs from multiple angles, and documented the stride length, which was approximately 7 feet, indicating bipedal locomotion by something significantly taller than a human. My scientific training demanded that I consider all rational explanations before jumping to conclusions about unknown species. The tracks could potentially be an elaborate hoax, though the remote location and the fact that my research presence in the area had not been publicized made that seem unlikely. The thermal footage could potentially show a person in a costume, though the heat signature patterns would be extremely difficult to fake with any material I was aware of. The livestock kills could still be explained by known predators if I was willing to accept some statistical outliers in terms of size and strength. But the cumulative evidence was pointing toward something that did not fit neatly into any category I had studied. I repositioned several of my cameras to focus specifically on the creek area and the game trails that led to it, hoping to capture additional footage that would either confirm or refute what I had recorded. I also began carrying my pepper spray and air horn at all times, along with a satellite phone for emergency communication, because if there was an apex predator in this area that was significantly larger and more powerful than a black bear, I needed to be prepared for a potentially dangerous encounter. On the night of September 29th, I got more than I had bargained for. I was camped, approximately half a mile from the creek, having set up my tent in a small clearing that provided good sight lines in multiple directions. At 3:33 a.m., I woke to the sound of something large moving through the forest nearby, snapping branches and rustling undergrowth in a way that indicated significant mass. I grabbed my thermal monocular and scanned the tree line, spotting a heat signature approximately 80 yards from my tent. The figure was bipedal, massive, and moving directly toward my location with what appeared to be deliberate purpose rather than random wandering. I activated my phone's video recording function and filmed through the thermal monocular as the figure approached to within 30 yards of my tent. At that distance, I could make out details that the thermal imaging revealed. The creature was covered in hair or fur that provided insulation, showing up as a cooler surface temperature compared to the exposed skin of the face and hands. The face was ape-like, but with features that seemed more human than gorilla, with deep-set eyes, a prominent brow ridge, and a mouth structure that appeared capable of a wide range of expressions. The hand showed 5 fingers, with proportions between human and ape, clearly visible when the creature used them to push aside low branches. The encounter lasted approximately 4 minutes, during which the creature circled my campsite at a distance, occasionally pausing to examine my tent and gear from different angles. I remained inside my tent, filming continuously, my heart racing but my hand steady enough to keep the monocular focused on the target. The creature made no vocalizations, showed no signs of aggression, but also demonstrated no fear of my presence or my equipment. It appeared curious rather than threatening, investigating my camp with what seemed like intelligent deliberation rather than animal instinct. When the creature finally moved away, disappearing back into the forest with surprising speed and silence for something so large, I waited until dawn before leaving my tent. I immediately checked all my trail cameras, finding that 3 of them had captured footage of the same creature, or possibly multiple individuals moving through the area during the night. The video footage showed the same massive bipedal figure, moving with a gait that was distinctly different from human locomotion, using a bent knee posture that distributed weight differently and allowed for greater stability on uneven terrain. I hiked out to the nearest ranger station that morning and reported what I had documented, showing the thermal footage and trail camera videos to the rangers on duty. Their reaction was not what I expected. Instead of skepticism or dismissal, Ranger Thomas Kirkland, who appeared to be in his late 50s and had been working in this area for over 2 decades, watched the footage with an expression of resignation rather than surprise. He asked me to wait while he made some phone calls, then invited me into a back office where he showed me files that were not part of any official Park Service database. The files contained 47 separate reports of similar sightings in the Clingman's Dome area over the past 10 years, all describing creatures matching what I had filmed. The reports came from hikers, hunters, park rangers, and local residents, many including photographs or video footage of varying quality. Some reports dated back much further, with references to Cherokee oral histories describing the Sulkalu, a race of giants who inhabited the mountains and protected the game animals from human hunters. Kirkland explained that the Park Service had been quietly documenting these encounters for decades, but had never publicized the information due to concerns about public safety, tourism impact, and the likelihood that increased human attention would drive the creatures deeper into hiding or potentially provoke defensive behavior. Kirkland arranged for me to meet with Dr. Patricia Hendricks, a primatologist who had been consulting with the Park Service off the record about the sightings. Dr. Hendricks had reviewed hundreds of hours of footage and examined physical evidence, including hair samples, footprint casts, and even scat that showed dietary patterns consistent with an omnivorous primate. Her analysis suggested that if the creatures were real rather than an elaborate long-term hoax, they represented either an unknown species of North American great ape or a relict population of a species thought to be extinct. The hair samples showed DNA that was similar to, but distinct from both human and known ape species, with genetic markers that did not match anything in existing databases. Dr. Hendricks strongly advised me not to publish my findings or share the footage publicly. Her reasoning was both practical and ethical. If the existence of these creatures became widely known and accepted by the scientific community, the Clingman's Dome area would be overrun with researchers, cryptozoologists, hunters, and thrill seekers, all potentially disrupting the creature's habitat and forcing confrontations that could be dangerous for both humans and the animals. The creatures had apparently coexisted with humans in these mountains for thousands of years by remaining hidden and avoiding contact, and revealing their existence would destroy that equilibrium. I spent the next 2 weeks completing my official research on known predator species, documenting black bear behavior and coyote populations in a way that satisfied my academic requirements without mentioning the creatures I had actually encountered. I collected my trail cameras, packed up my equipment, and returned to Virginia Tech with footage and data that I knew would revolutionize primatology and cryptozoology if I chose to release it. But I also carried the weight of understanding that some discoveries might be more important to protect than to publicize. I completed my PhD dissertation on conventional predator-prey dynamics without including any reference to the bipedal creatures. My research was well received, and I secured a postdoctoral position at a research institution in Oregon, where I continued to study large mammal ecology. But I have returned to the Clingman's Dome area every year since that first encounter, always in autumn, always setting up cameras in the same locations, always hoping for another glimpse of the creatures that challenged everything I thought I understood about North American wildlife. I have captured additional footage on 4 separate occasions over the past 3 years, each time showing the same massive bipedal figures, or possibly others like them, always at night, always exhibiting behavior that suggests high intelligence and deliberate avoidance of human contact. I have shared this footage with a small network of researchers who study similar phenomena across North America, and we have documented parallel cases from British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and other locations in the Appalachian Range. The pattern is consistent across multiple geographic areas and time periods, suggesting a species, or possibly multiple related species, that have successfully avoided scientific documentation through intelligent behavior and habitat selection. The indigenous peoples who inhabited these mountains for thousands of years before European colonization have always maintained that these creatures exist. The Cherokee stories about Sulkalu and similar beings in other tribal traditions are not metaphors or cautionary tales, but accurate descriptions of real animals that share these forests with humans. The Western scientific establishment has dismissed these accounts as folklore because they challenge our assumptions about what species exist in North America and what kinds of large mammals could remain undiscovered in relatively populated regions. I have made the decision to keep my most compelling footage and data private, sharing it only with researchers I trust to approach the subject with scientific rigor and ethical consideration. I continue to publish conventional research on predator behavior and ecosystem dynamics, maintaining my academic credibility while conducting parallel research on phenomena that I know exist but cannot prove to the satisfaction of peer review without exposing the creatures to exploitation and harm. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice by prioritizing protection over discovery, by keeping secret something that would fundamentally alter our understanding of North American biodiversity. But then I remember the way that creature looked at my tent, the intelligence visible even through thermal imaging, the careful deliberation with which it investigated my campsite without showing aggression or fear. These are not primitive animals acting on instinct alone. These are intelligent beings who have earned the right to continue existing in the shadows, free from the disruption and danger that scientific and public attention would inevitably bring. The livestock predation that originally brought me to this research area has decreased significantly over the past 2 years, suggesting that the creatures have either moved to different hunting grounds or have learned to avoid detection by targeting wild prey rather than domestic animals. The farmers in the area still report occasional incidents that they attribute to unknown predators, but wildlife officials now quietly compensate them for losses without conducting extensive investigations that might draw unwanted attention to the area. I sleep well at night, knowing that I have contributed to protecting something extraordinary, something that deserves to exist without being captured, studied, displayed, or destroyed by human curiosity and greed. The Appalachian Mountains still hold mysteries that science has not explained, species that have survived by remaining hidden, phenomena that challenge our certainty about what is known and what remains to be discovered. And sometimes the most important contribution a scientist can make is recognizing that some knowledge should be guarded rather than shared, that some discoveries are more valuable when they remain undiscovered by the world at large. At 36, I had spent the previous decade building a successful tech startup that I sold 2 years ago for enough money to never work again if I chose not to. The sale had been the culmination of 80-hour work weeks, constant stress, and a complete absence of anything resembling work-life balance. My therapist suggested I needed to disconnect completely from technology for an extended period to experience what she called a digital detox that would help me rediscover parts of myself that had been suppressed by years of screen time and endless connectivity. The Appalachian Trail seemed like the perfect environment for this reset, particularly the Virginia section, which offered beautiful scenery without the extreme difficulty of more challenging portions of the trail. I started my section hike on September 18th, entering at Rockfish Gap and planning to hike roughly 120 miles north over 2 weeks. I carried minimal technology, just a basic satellite emergency beacon and a simple GPS device that I only checked once per day to verify my position. No smartphone, no laptop, no connection to email or social media or any of the digital infrastructure that had consumed my life for the past decade. The first few days were difficult, as I experienced what could only be described as withdrawal symptoms from the lack of constant stimulation and information flow. But by day 4 or 5, I was starting to appreciate the silence and simplicity of trail life. On September 22nd, my 5th day on the trail, I reached McAfee Knob around 4:30 in the afternoon. McAfee Knob is probably the most photographed location on the entire Appalachian Trail, a spectacular rocky outcrop that juts out from the ridgeline and provides panoramic views of the Catawba Valley below. Hundreds of hikers visit this spot every year, often timing their arrival for sunrise or sunset to capture the dramatic lighting. I had planned to camp near the viewpoint and photograph the sunrise the next morning, then continue northbound toward Dragon's Tooth and beyond. I set up my tent in a designated camping area about a quarter mile from the actual viewpoint, filtered water from a nearby stream, and prepared dinner as dusk settled over the mountains. The night passed normally, and I woke around 5:30 a.m. on September 23rd to hike up to McAfee Knob for sunrise photography. The morning was clear and cool, perfect conditions for the kind of images I wanted to capture. I reached the viewpoint around 6 a.m., set up my camera on a tripod, and spent the next hour photographing as the sun rose over the distant ridgelines and illuminated the valley in shades of orange and gold. After finishing my photography session around 7:15 a.m., I packed my camera gear and started hiking north on the clearly marked Appalachian Trail. The trail from McAfee Knob is well maintained and heavily trafficked, with white blazes painted on trees every 100 feet or so to guide hikers. I hiked for what felt like approximately 2 hours, covering what I estimated to be 5 or 6 miles based on my pace and the terrain. But when I stopped to check my GPS and compare my position to my map, I discovered something that made no sense whatsoever. According to the GPS coordinates, I was back at McAfee Knob, at the exact location where I had taken sunrise photographs 2 hours earlier. I assumed the GPS was malfunctioning, showing cached coordinates from my previous position rather than my current location. I reset the device, waited for it to reacquire satellite signals, and checked again. Same coordinates, same location shown on the map. I looked around at my physical surroundings and confirmed that I was definitely not at McAfee Knob. I was on a section of trail that ran through dense forest with no views, completely different from the exposed rock outcrop of the viewpoint. But my GPS insisted I had not moved at all from the coordinates where I had been standing at 6:00 a.m. I continued hiking north, now paying much closer attention to landmarks and trail markers, documenting my progress through photographs of distinctive trees and rock formations. After another hour of hiking, I checked my GPS again, still showing McAfee Knob coordinates. I was now convinced the device was broken, so I relied on following the white blazes and matching topographic features to my paper map. By my estimation, I should have been approaching the Johns Creek Valley area, roughly 10 miles north of McAfee Knob. Around noon, I emerged from a wooded section of trail onto a rocky outcrop with spectacular views, and my stomach dropped when I realized I was looking at the exact same vista I had photographed at sunrise. Same valley, same angle, same distinctive rock formations. I was back at McAfee Knob, having somehow completed a circle despite hiking exclusively northbound on a trail that did not loop back on itself. I checked the photographs on my camera, comparing the distinctive tree stumps and rock features visible in my sunrise images with what I could see around me. It was undeniably the same location. I sat down on the rock trying to understand what was happening, reviewing the past 6 hours in my mind to identify where I might have made a navigation error. But I had followed the white blazes continuously, had never deviated from the main trail, had encountered no trail junctions where I might have accidentally turned around. The Appalachian Trail does not make any loops in this section, and there are no parallel trails that would create the kind of circular route I seem to have traveled. I decided to try again, this time being even more methodical about documenting my progress. I took photographs of every trail blaze I passed, marked distinctive landmarks on my map, and maintained a careful pace count to measure distance traveled. I started hiking north at 12:30 p.m. 3 hours later, I emerged onto McAfee Knob again, having completed another impossible circle. The photographs I had taken showed a continuous northbound route along the Appalachian Trail, with no missed turns or navigation errors visible in the documentation. By this point, I was starting to panic. Something fundamentally wrong was happening that I could not explain through equipment failure or navigation error. I was trapped in some kind of spatial loop that kept returning me to McAfee Knob regardless of which direction I hiked or how carefully I navigated. I checked my satellite emergency beacon to see if I could get a message out to search and rescue, but when I activated it, the coordinates it transmitted were the same McAfee Knob location my GPS had been showing all day. I made the decision to stay at McAfee Knob rather than attempt another hike that would inevitably loop back to the same location. I set up my tent near the viewpoint and tried to sleep, but spent most of the night awake, trying to understand what was happening and what I could do to escape this impossible situation. At 3:33 a.m., I woke from a brief period of sleep to find myself back in my tent, but something felt different. I checked my GPS, and for the first time since the loop began, it showed different coordinates. I was no longer at McAfee Knob, according to the device. I was approximately 8 miles north, near Dragon's Tooth. When dawn came, I packed my camp and started hiking, not sure whether I would complete another loop or if whatever had trapped me at McAfee Knob had finally released its hold. After 2 hours of northbound hiking, I reached a road crossing where I encountered 2 other hikers who were starting a day hike. I asked them what the date was, and they told me it was September 26th. 3 full days had passed since I first arrived at McAfee Knob, but I only remembered experiencing September 23rd repeatedly, the same day looping over and over while I hiked circles that returned me to the same starting point. I hiked out to the nearest town and tried to make sense of what had happened. I checked the timestamps on my photographs, which showed continuous shooting throughout September 23rd, but nothing from September 24th or 25th. My GPS track log showed only the McAfee Knob coordinates repeated hundreds of times over a 3-day period, with no record of the miles I had hiked during each loop attempt. It was as if time itself had been stuck on September 23rd while I experienced the same day repeatedly, only breaking free and advancing to September 26th, when I stayed at the viewpoint overnight rather than trying to hike away from it. I researched McAfee Knob extensively after returning home, looking for any reports of similar experiences or any explanation for what I had encountered. I found references to a hiker who had died at McAfee Knob in 2019, falling from the rock outcrop while attempting to take a photograph. The death had occurred on September 23rd, the exact date that had repeated for me 3 times. I also discovered that my satellite emergency beacon had automatically activated at 3:33 a.m. on September 23rd, transmitting a distress signal that search and rescue had logged, but then canceled when they could not reach me for verification, and my beacon showed I was in a well-traveled area with no indication of injury. The most disturbing discovery came when I connected with the family of the hiker who had died in 2019. His name was Robert Chen, 34 years old, a software engineer from San Francisco who had been section hiking the Virginia portion of the trail. According to his family, Robert had been keeping a detailed journal of his hike, and his final entries described experiencing a sense of repetition, of hiking away from McAfee Knob but somehow returning to it multiple times. His final journal entry, written on the morning he died, mentioned that he felt trapped in a loop and was considering staying at the viewpoint to see if that would break the pattern. Hours later, he fell from the cliff in circumstances that were never fully explained. I believe I experienced a premonition or temporal anomaly that showed me what would have happened if I had continued trying to escape the loop by hiking away from McAfee Knob. Robert had apparently done the same thing, attempting to break free by continuing to hike, and it had somehow led to his death when he returned to the viewpoint, exhausted and disoriented. By choosing to stay at McAfee Knob overnight rather than attempting another loop, I had broken the pattern in a way Robert had not, and time had resumed its normal flow, jumping forward 3 days to September 26th. I reported the experience to park rangers and showed them the documentation I had gathered, the photographs showing impossible loops, the GPS logs showing repeated coordinates, the 3-day gap in my memory and records. They listened with what appeared to be genuine concern rather than skepticism, and one of the rangers mentioned that McAfee Knob had a reputation among long-term trail maintainers for unusual occurrences, particularly around the anniversary dates of accidents and deaths that had occurred at the location. She said other hikers had reported time anomalies and spatial distortions at McAfee Knob, always on dates corresponding to previous deaths, though the reports were not publicized to avoid creating panic or attracting the wrong kind of attention to the site. I never completed my section hike. The experience at McAfee Knob had accomplished what my therapist wanted, forcing me to disconnect from technology and confront something that could not be explained or controlled through engineering solutions. But it had also shown me that reality was far stranger and more fragile than I had ever imagined. That time and space could behave in ways that violated everything I understood about physics and causality. I returned to McAfee Knob 6 months later, on March 23rd, to leave a memorial for Robert Chen and to see if the location felt any different during a time period not associated with his death or my experience. The viewpoint was peaceful and normal, crowded with day hikers taking photographs and enjoying the views. but I could not shake the feeling that the loop was still there, waiting for the right conditions or the right person to activate again, trapping someone else in a repeating day until they either figured out how to escape or shared Robert's fate. I check news reports about McAfee Knob compulsively now, looking for any mention of accidents or mysterious circumstances around September 23rd each year. So far, nothing has been reported that matches what I experienced, but I know the pattern is there. Know that something about that specific date and that specific location creates conditions where time does not flow in the linear way we assume it must. Some places hold memories of traumatic events, and some of those memories are strong enough to trap the living in patterns established by the dead. McAfee Knob is one of those places, beautiful and deadly and impossible in ways that should not exist but undeniably do.